Así que bienvenidos y vamos a empezar con Mark Lopez, alguien que yo admiro muchísimo. Mark Lopez es una de las personas que más conoce sobre la población latina en este país en una profundidad, con información y no solo sentido común, con una cantidad de información, y él ha sido muy generoso de compartir con nosotros la información del Pew Center. Es el jefe del Hispanic Research en el Pew Center y tiene todo lo que afirma está sostenido en números y en datos. Y te agradezco muchísimo por estar acá y es un honor para nosotros que puedas abrir esta conferencia. Okay, bienvenido.
Good morning. Excuse me for being a little bit hot here, a little bit warm here today. I see that the title that I have here is one that is a little bit different than what's on the program, but there's actually something that I realized that I wanted to change, and I didn't change it in time for this presentation, which is the title of the presentation totally. I'd say U.S. Latino community. And when we talk about Latinos, we oftentimes use the word community to refer to this group, this population. But I think it's important to note that instead it's probably better to say the U.S. Latino population, because community implies similar points of view across a number of issues. And while that may be true on some things, there is great diversity within the Latino community. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is how diverse this community is and how it is changing. Because a lot of the stories that we would tell 10 years ago about the Latino community, that is, it's a community of immigrants, a community of undocumented immigrants, that story is starting to change in many ways, and really the future is one of U.S.-born young Latinos making their way into adulthood and starting to shape a number of different trends that we see within the community. I want to talk about all those trends. Of course, I'm always open to questions, so I look forward to your questions at the end. And please, if you have any questions about Pew Research, I'd be happy to answer any of those too. A quick note about Pew Research: we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization. That means we take no positions on policies. So if somebody today asks me, what should we do about Donald Trump, or what should Donald Trump do about Latinos, I'm going to say, I don't know. So where are we in terms of the size of the U.S. Hispanic population? Well, some new numbers just came out yesterday from the Census Bureau. And the new population estimate puts that number at about 57.5 million in 2016. So 57.5 million people in the United States say that they are of Hispanic or Latino or Spanish origin. Now keep in mind what I just said. They say they are of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, which means they are self-identifying to be a part of this group. That also means there are some people who may have Hispanic ancestry and say they do have that ancestry, but will not self-identify as Hispanic or Latino. So keep in mind that this is about a self-identified population. Now, this population is also quite diverse, and usually when people think about the diversity, this is the diversity they think of, along the lines of origin. About 35, almost 36 million people in the United States who are of Hispanic origin are of Mexican origin. They trace their roots to Mexico. That's people like me. Now, I was born in the United States. My parents were born in the United States, but I still take great pride in the fact that I have roots in Mexico, still have family in Mexico City. Another 5.4 million are of Puerto Rican origin. Now, I want to stress that this is just Puerto Rican origin Hispanics who live in the 50 states plus D.C. You include the island, that's an additional 3 to 3.5 million people. So you're talking about 8 million plus, 9 million plus people in the United States who are of Puerto Rican origin. Next come Salvadorans and Cubans, and I'm going to come back to them, followed by Dominicans, Guatemalans, and Colombians. Those are all the origin groups with over 1 million people. Now, why Salvadorans and Cubans? Why are they highlighted? Well, for the longest time, Cubans were the third largest Hispanic group. And the Cuban population continues to grow. It is one that is growing as we see people in the last few years arrive from Cuba, who have left Cuba to come to the United States, and there's many who still want to come to the United States. And so you continue to see somewhat of an in-migration. Salvadorans are actually one of the big in-migration groups lately of Latinos. So they too are seeing an influx of new immigrants. But what's interesting is Cubans were largely the third largest group among Hispanics for the longest time, since the 1950s. And recently, Salvadorans and Cubans have been sort of jostling back and forth to see who might be number 3. So when you're talking about Hispanics, it's not just Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans. It's Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Salvadorans, Cubans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, Colombians, etc. So it's much more than just the traditionally three largest groups. Where do Hispanics live? Well, all these counties, about half of them have at least 1,000 Hispanics. So about one half of the 3,000 plus US counties have 1,000 Hispanics. And in fact, one of the big stories of Hispanic population growth has been dispersion. Look at Alaska. I got to go to Alaska. I wonder if there's any Mexican restaurants in Alaska. I'm sure that there are, right? So I got to go check them out. But the story of the Hispanic population has really been one of dispersion. And this has largely been driven by the arrival of new immigrants. So a lot of the growth in the South in the last 20 years has really come from people who moved to the United States from other countries. And of course, you take a look at a place like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, have had long-standing Hispanic populations. Nonetheless, it's been a story of dispersion. Now, this last election had an impact on the way Latinos see things going for the group. And when you take a look at their attitudes, you'll see that a growing share, 32%, according to our most recent survey of Hispanics, say that things have actually gotten worse in the last year for the community. About 16% say things have gotten better, 49% say things have been about the same. But you can see that the share that say things have gotten worse has gone up from 2015 when it was only 15%. So there's a general sense among Latinos that things have gotten worse in the last year, perhaps due to Donald Trump's election. We didn't tie it exactly to that in this question, but nonetheless, many Latinos see things getting worse for the community. This despite improving incomes, declining unemployment rates, and improving home ownership rates. So despite improvements on economic indicators, we see many Latinos continuing to point to a worsening situation. So that's just a little bit of background. Let's talk about some of the big trends that are shaping the community. Already, I talked to you about Hispanic population growth. It's continuing, but it's slowing. And the dispersion across the country, too, is slowing. So the story of Hispanics, which has really been one about fast growth, in fact, sometimes even the fastest growing group, and one of dispersion around the country, it's not necessarily as true as it used to be. The second thing that's interesting is births are now driving population growth. It's not immigration anymore. And that's largely because Mexican immigration has actually reversed back towards Mexico in terms of flows. Did you know there are no more Mexicans leaving the United States now than actually arrive? There are still arrivals, of course, but the numbers are changing. Also, as a result of the decline of immigration, the foreign-born share has fallen, and half of US-born Hispanics today, the population that's going to shape things for the future, is under the age of 19. So when you talk about this coming wave of US-born young Latinos, they're still in high school, they're still in elementary school, they haven't even entered school yet. And really, the story of the future for Latinos as a group is going to be driven and shaped to a large extent by these US-born young Hispanics. As a result of that rise of the US-born, though, English use is also on the rise. That's not to say that Spanish is falling off of the table. But what's happening is we are seeing a growing number of this young under 19 population living in a household where only English is spoken. And I'll show you some numbers for that. What about population growth? Here you can see from 2000 to 2007 compared with 2007 to 14, the decline in population growth. Still positive, but less than it had been. A lot of this is really because of the decline of immigration. That's really the big story here, is the decline of immigration. What about where has the population been growing the fastest? So between 2000 and 2013, where was it growing fastest? Those are the darkest purple counties here. And you can see a lot of it is in the south. Look at Florida. Florida is really just a fast-growing Hispanic population. And if you take a look at the central part of the mid-Atlantic, like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., also pretty fast-growing Hispanic populations recently. But it is also a story of negative growth. It's not true that the Latino population is growing everywhere. And in fact, it's actually declining in places that have been some of the most traditional Hispanic places in the country. Take a look at New Mexico. You'll see that New Mexico has many declining population counties, as does western Texas, and as does southern Colorado. These are some of the places where the traditional Hispanic population, original Spanish settlers, had come in and settled these places. But there's also limited economic opportunity here compared to other parts of the country. So people are moving. And these are largely US-born populations, by the way. Now, when we talk about the sources of growth, just to emphasize how important births are compared to immigration, you can see that through the 1990s, immigration was the leader in contributing to Hispanic population growth in the decade. But look at what happened in the 2000s. Births just totally overtook immigration and the arrival of new immigrants as a source of population growth. That has had tremendous impact on the share foreign-born. We reached a peak of about 40% in 2000. It's now in decline. And it's not just Mexicans, by the way, who are seeing this decline. It's actually across the board. So all the origin groups have seen a decline in their foreign-born share. Now, there's some really high foreign-born shares among some groups, like Guatemalans. 64% are foreign-born, for example, versus only 33% among Mexicans. Puerto Ricans are not on this because their foreign-born share, of course, is pretty close to zero. But it does give you, I had some people ask me.
I appreciate that.
I was going to have it on here, but I thought it would have been like, well, yeah. You can see that the foreign-born share is falling across the board. Now, I know that's a little bit of a somewhat less positive story than we usually tell about Latinos. But let's talk about the role that Latinos have played in reshaping immigration over the course of the last 50 years. Now, when you take a look at the sources of immigrants to the United States, and by the way, 59 million people have arrived in the United States since 1965. Those are immigrants. 59 million people. Now, the U.S. population of immigrants is people born in another country, stands today at 45 million. So 59 million, why so much higher than the 45? Well, people pass away, that's one, and people return home, that's two. So the flow in also includes a flow, there's also a flow out, and there's also sort of a stabilization at some population number. And you should know that for the United States as a whole, about 13.5%, maybe 13.8 now, are foreign-born. We are approaching a record high in the foreign-born share for the U.S. population. The high was reached in 1890 at about 14.5%. So we are getting close to that record high. Now, where are these immigrants from in this latest wave? You can see that Latin America is a big, big source. Half of all immigrants, of that 59 million, from Latin America. So Latin America, in the last 50 years, has been the big source of immigrants to the United States. Southeast Asia, another 25%, and Europe, just 12%. But you can see the stark contrast with the past. In the past, Latin America really wasn't contributing to immigrant population growth in the United States, at least the arrival of immigrants, compared with Europeans. Now, another way to look at this, by the way, this is one of my favorite set of maps, in case you were wondering. You ever want to say, so what are Mark's favorite maps? There they are. So in 1960, this map shows you in each state who was the largest immigrant group. Who was the largest immigrant group? And you can see Mexico along the U.S.-Mexico border, no surprise. Canadians up along the Canadian-U.S. border for the most part. And it really is the story of the early 20th century. Germans, Poles, Italians, Swedes, Russians. Those were the large immigrant groups who, by 1960, were in their 60s and 70s. So many of them were later in life at this point. But there hadn't been a large influx of immigrants because we hadn't changed the law for the United States just yet. Look at what happens by 2013. I have to take a swig of my coffee. So by 2013, it's a very different story. But this, again, reflects the sources of immigrants that have come into the United States since 1965. So you can see Mexico is the largest immigrant group, or Mexicans are the largest immigrant group in about 31 states. Salvadorans in the Mid-Atlantic, Cubans, Florida, Filipinos in Alaska and Hawaii, Canadians kind of along the northern border. There's Dominicans, there's Jamaicans, there's Chinese, there's Indian, and Ethiopian. And I oftentimes get asked, well, why Ethiopia in South Dakota? Well, first, there's not a lot of immigrants in South Dakota, but there has been a refugee resettlement program there that has brought Ethiopians to South Dakota. So that has led to them being the largest immigrant group in South Dakota in 2013. So it's interesting. Latinos have been a big part of the immigrant story for the United States for some time. I haven't talked about undocumented immigration or unauthorized immigration yet, but you should know that among the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States today, that's an estimate, by the way, about 8 million plus are from Latin America, with most of those, 5 million plus, being of Mexican origin. So Mexicans make up about half of all undocumented immigrants to the United States. But there are undocumented immigrants from other parts of the world. In fact, one of the undocumented immigrant populations that's been growing has been those from India, which is now at about 500,000 people, but just a few years ago was at 300,000. So that gives you some sense that when we're talking about undocumented immigration, it is not just a Latin American issue. It is actually has people representing every part of the world, including Africa, including Europe, and including Asia. So getting back to the story of immigrants, as you know, the immigrant arrivals from Latin America have been in decline. You can see this decline happening starting even before the Great Recession. In 2005, we reached a peak of over 4 million recent arrivals coming in the previous 5 years. That's almost 1 million people a year. Today, we're down to 1.7 from Central and South America. Asia, on the other hand, has been on the rise. But note that this switch is really not a switch about Asia surging and Latin America falling. It's really more about Asia staying kind of on path, but Latin America declining. In the case of Mexico, when we talk about Mexican migration, these are the flows into the United States and into Mexico of Mexican immigrants. 95% of all Mexican immigrants worldwide, so people who leave Mexico, they come to the United States. So the U.S. is the principal destination for Mexican immigrants worldwide. You can see that between 1995 and 2000, there were many more Mexicans coming than leaving. In 2005 to 2010, equal. And then between 2009 and 2014, a slight outmigration. So the number leaving is now greater than the number arriving. And it seems like these patterns have continued as the number of Mexicans choosing to come to the United States continues to fall. That means that when we talk about the U.S. Mexican origin population as an example, its foreign-born share is in decline. We've actually lost over 1 million Mexican immigrants since 2007. Let me say that again. We've lost over 1 million Mexican immigrants in the United States since 2007. That's how many people have left. And when you take a look at the number who are unauthorized immigrants, you'll find that the unauthorized immigrants are largely the biggest part of this outmigration. Most of this loss of 1 million is coming from people who were in the United States illegally. That's who principally has been going home. Meantime, though, the population overall of Mexican origin people in the United States continues to rise. And look, you can see the pace here at which it's rising. And by the way, this is another one of my favorite charts. You know why? Because look, it goes all the way back to 1850. I mean, how often do we have data that goes back to 1850 on something? So I'm just really happy. So the Mexican origin population has become more and more U.S. born. And I think that's really, again, an important fact to keep in mind. Now, I don't want to just talk about Mexicans, because Mexicans are not the only immigrant group from Latin America. Here's what's been happening with Cubans. Now, this is all prior to the President Obama's elimination of the wet foot, dry foot policy. But you can see that there was a surge in outmigration from Cuba in the last few years. We'll have to see what happens. Donald Trump has not reversed Obama on this wet foot, dry foot policy, but we'll see what happens. Also, the story is not just about Cuba and Mexico and immigrants, but also people leaving Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico's outmigration has been accelerating in recent years. Now, we have the ability to update this chart because we just got some new data yesterday, but if you were to update this, the acceleration would be even greater. So these are the net migration out of Puerto Rico into the United States. And as you can see, it's been going on for some time. Now, the Latino population in the U.S. is young. So I'm going to shift gears here and talk about young Latinos for a little bit. The median age is 28, much lower than it is for whites, Asians, or blacks. And it's been rising, but as you can see, continues to remain below the other racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. What's also interesting is how young these groups are. 3/4 of U.S.-born Latinos are either millennials or younger. 3/4. Let me say that again. 3/4 of U.S.-born Latinos are either millennials or younger. That means they're under 35. 3/4 are under 35. I'm like I realize, God, I'm really old. So, and you can see that among immigrant Latinos, most of them are much older. So that foreign-born Hispanics are an older population. Many have been in the U.S. for 10 years or more. What about in terms of speaking English? When it comes to speaking English at home, or speaking only English at home, that's the bottom part of these bars. You can see that among those ages 5 to 17, 37% live in a household where only English is spoken. That doesn't mean that they just speak English. They may speak Spanish, but they live in a household where only English is spoken. So they're probably primarily English speakers. But you can see that the future is going to be one of a higher English-only share among Latinos, just looking at this particular chart. As these young people enter adulthood, that's probably going to have implications for the number who speak Spanish in the country. Now, admittedly, we don't have very good estimates of the number of Spanish speakers in the United States. This is the number of Spanish speakers among Hispanics in the United States, according to the Census Bureau. But look at how the question is asked. The question is asked only of people ages 5 and older. And the question goes like this: do you speak a language other than English at home? What language is that? So this is the number of people who say they speak Spanish at home. Now, speaking Spanish at home, when I was growing up, and I will admit my Spanish was not very good growing up. My mom used to have Spanish Saturdays, and I'm like, God, Mom, do we have to? So Spanish was spoken at my home, but I was not Spanish proficient. So you should keep in mind that this is a rough measure of how many people speak Spanish. That number is 37 million. Among Latinos who say that they're English proficient, because the follow-up question is, if you say you speak Spanish at home, they'll then ask you, how well do you speak English? And anybody who said they speak only English at home are assumed to be proficient in English. You can see that number is rising and catching up to the 37 million. When you take a look at it with a different set of questions, though, and this is really, I think, an important set of questions to keep in mind, which is, what if you ask people, how well do you read, say, a newspaper in Spanish? How well can you speak or carry on a conversation in Spanish? Just self-report. And then the same 2 questions for English. So you got a 4-component set of questions to generate this measure. We can then say somebody is Spanish dominant, bilingual, or English dominant. And this is something we've been doing at Pew Research for a long time. And you can see that among Hispanic adults, about 1/3 are Spanish dominant, 40% bilingual, and 1/4 English dominant. Among immigrants, 55% are Spanish dominant, but among those 3rd and higher generation, people like me, 71% are English dominant. Again, that doesn't mean that they speak Spanish, but it seems that they do better in English than they do in Spanish, just so that you're aware. We also asked Hispanics recently, do you think it's important that you speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic in the United States? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because this gets at the identity of the community, which, by the way, is changing too. 71% said no. It's not necessary to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic. Among the foreign-born, 58% said that. So interestingly, among immigrant Hispanics, 58% said you don't have to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic. And you can see that among the US-born, 87% say that. So Spanish, while still growing in numbers, while still reaching new highs, and no other language comes close to Spanish as a non-English language in the United States. Chinese is only at about 2 million, 2.5 million. The views of Latinos themselves and the ways that they speak Spanish, or how many of them speak Spanish, those numbers appear to be beginning to change. Now, I know that I'm running short on time here, and I want to close with 2 slides. This first one is a broader look at identity. When you take a look at Latinos and you ask them, what do you consider yourself? And remember, these are people who self-identify as being part of this group. what do you consider yourself? Do you ever call yourself Mexican by your origin term? Do you ever consider yourself Hispanic or Latino? Do you ever consider yourself American? And which of those do you use most often? Well, you can see that among Hispanic millennials particularly, half of them say that they use their family's country of origin term to describe themselves most often. That's followed by 24% who say American and 22% say Hispanic or Latino. And among millennials, you can see that those who are US born are somewhat more mixed in their responses than those who are foreign born. So identity across the generations is changing. One other little side note, a trend that I think is important for explaining changes in the Hispanic community. Did you know that 28% of all Hispanic newlyweds marry somebody who isn't Hispanic? Did you know that 27% of all children under the age of 1 who live with both their parents have one parent that's Hispanic and one parent that's not? In other words, there's a lot of mixing. By the time you get to the third generation, you oftentimes will have many young Latinos, almost half of them will be of parents who one is Hispanic and one is not Hispanic. So we are starting to see, as immigration falls and as the US born continue to be a big part of the story of population growth for Hispanics, that there's a lot of mixing. That could mean that in the future, the very way in which we think of identity, and that's why I shared with you that Spanish is not necessary to be considered Hispanic, the very nature of Hispanic identity might be changing. That's why you begin to hear about terms like Latinx or Latinx. It's a new way of thinking about Hispanic identity. Finally, what about the issues that are most important to the Latino community? Now this is from, the Latino population. This is based off of a survey we did in January of this year. So I wonder if this has changed since then. But when you take a look at this, you can see that education is number 1, protection from terrorist attacks number 2, and strengthening the nation's economy is number 3. Dealing with the issue of immigration was at the bottom of this list. And this is something that comes up regularly in our surveys, that immigration doesn't necessarily always rate as the top issue for everybody. Now, it may be a real pressing issue for some parts of the Latino community, but not all Latinos feel the same about the issue of immigration. I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to take questions. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
We're going to take 2 questions. He's taking the first with that mic, so in that area, and I'm going to go there for the second question.
Okay. Want to do that one first?
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Hey, Mark.
Hi.
It's working?
Yeah, it was working.
So I have a question. I also love maps, so you're not the only Latino nerd in the room. I would like to ask you about the term Latinx. It was a term that, as a journalist, I really didn't like. And something about it seems to be more inclusive in its language.
Seems more inclusive.
Inclusive, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that at some point the Pew Research Center will rename itself and not use the term Hispanic?
It's a great question. I don't foresee us changing our name anytime soon because it's a brand that we've had for a long time. I do, though, see us doing research in this area. We've done a lot of work asking, for example, Latinos, do you consider yourself Afro-Latino? Because the race question on the census doesn't really get at Afro-Latino-ness, and you have to directly ask about it. What about, are you mestizo, mestiza? We've asked that too. And you know, you ask these questions on an Afro-Latino, about 30% will say that they are. A mestizo, mestiza, about 35%. Those are much higher than what you see in the Census Bureau. So we've asked about different ways in which Latinos see their identity, and I want to ask about this next. My sense is that a lot of people within the Latino population don't know what this means, because I know I asked my mom, she's like, what? And you go outside the country and people are like, huh, what is that? So 2 thoughts, though, about it. On the one hand, yes, it is more inclusive. So it's meant to be inclusive, and it reflects, I think, a real American sensibility about inclusion. That really, though, means that it's something that when you talk about it with people outside the United States, they're like, what are you guys doing? Is sort of one of the reactions that you get. And I would stress that the terms Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx, These are all things that come out of the United States. That's our view of identity. Outside the country, they're either different, the same terms are used for different things, or they don't resonate. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens as this term takes off. But right now, I see it mostly among college students, mostly among people who are elites, and mostly among well, people who are in positions who are writing about stuff, like you all. You all, in some sense, are among the elites in the country.
Sorry. By elite, do you mean with a bachelor's? Do you mean a certain economic bracket? I need you to unpack
Both.
Okay.
I mean both, because it's people who are largely, it's a college-educated phenomena, is what it seems, and that's where you're really seeing it, is among college-educated people, because it's a phenomena that comes out of colleges and universities first, and then those graduates go along. But what I'm finding is people in positions of leadership in Washington, people in positions of leadership like yourselves, are using the term more often. But again, I don't hear it among my family back home, because they're not attuned to this. You cross the country and people are like, huh, what is that? So I think it's still kind of coming into its own. But we'll see where it goes. That's something that I think will be very interesting to see what happens. But it largely seems to be the college-educated Latino who's aware of it. I saw there was another question over here. Yes.
We have time for 2 questions.
Can you comment on the outflow, the Mexican migration outflow? How much of that is from deportation? And then separately, can you also comment to the extent that you've studied political engagement? Who votes? Who doesn't vote? How do they vote? Local elections. Does it matter when politicians make ads in Spanish? Does that matter?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm not sure I can give you an answer, but it's a good question. So first about the Mexican outmigration. A lot of it is actually people choosing to leave. People who have come to the end of their work lives and have decided to go home and retire. Surveys in Mexico of people who've come back through the EMIF, for example, largely most of the respondents say that they are doing so to be with family. Now, a good 15 to 20% say that they were deported. So those numbers do include deportations, but the majority say they're going home to be with family. I would also say that why this decline in Mexican migration to the United States? There's a couple of things on the Mexican side that I have not talked about. First, Mexicans in our surveys there are less likely to say that they see the United States as a place they want to go to. It's not something that they don't hold it in as high of a regard as they used to, partly because they don't know people, they know fewer people in the United States. Also, generally speaking, the view that life in the U.S. is better has declined over the last few years. Second thing, Mexico's demographics have changed. It's an older country. It doesn't have quite the same proportion of its population that's young that it used to. If anything, the world's probably next big migration source of migrants is going to be Africa, which has a very similar demographic profile to Mexico in the 1970s. In addition to having political conflict, economic challenges, those are probably going to lead to more migration out of Africa. Voting. In 2016, I'm sure you all followed this, there was an awful lot of discussion about the Latino vote. In fact, oftentimes I would get asked, are Latinos going to decide this election? Or Latinos are going to be the deciders of this election, aren't they? Is how it would be asked. It's always hard to answer that question because it's hard to predict the future. I just don't know. And so there was a lot of discussion about the Hispanic population, a lot of high expectations. In the end, the number of Hispanic voters did rise. It rose to about 12.5 million voters. However, that was below everybody's projections. That was below what everybody was expecting. In fact, the voter turnout rate was flat. It was 48% in 2012. It was 47.5% in 2016. So the voter turnout rate for Latinos didn't really go up. Now, the big story in 2016 was African Americans who saw their voter turnout rate fall by about 6 percentage points or 7 percentage points. The actual number of voters declined as well. So it was a striking year in a number of ways. Now, does Spanish language media reach those Latinos who might vote? I certainly think there's a case to be made for Spanish language media being an important way to communicate to Hispanics. However, it oftentimes is perhaps not getting those who are most likely to be voters, because registered voters are U.S. born and they're oftentimes young people. About 44% of all U.S. Latinos who are eligible to vote are Hispanic, U.S. born millennials. So they're voting for the first time, they're trying to figure it out, and they're probably English speaking first. So I think it's important to note that. Now, that's not to say that Spanish language media can't reach them. It can. But let me give you an example of where we saw, I think, perhaps one of the strongest results in any of our surveys ever about this divide, which is in 2010, we asked Hispanics about the census. Are you going to participate in the census? The census is a good thing. Are you willing to give your information to the census? Those who were Spanish dominant or who got their news in Spanish or who are Spanish dominant or are foreign born, they're like, yeah, it's great. I'm going to participate. Looking forward to it. I believe my information won't be misused. The English-speaking Latinos were like, no, I'm not going to participate. No, I don't want to give you my information. You're going to misuse it. Somebody's going to steal it. So there is really a divide here in terms of the community, another division, which is not just about US-born, foreign-born, different origin groups. There's also Spanish versus English. And one language doesn't sort of permeate the entire population. So one needs to be very cautious that when we talk about this group, if we're only focusing on Spanish, that's not going to reach a lot of young Latinos who are coming of age, who are US born, and also, quite frankly, a lot of older Hispanics who were born in the United States and didn't grow up speaking Spanish. So just something to keep in mind.
Muchísimas gracias, Mark.
Sí. Thank you.